Now, I'd better say at the outset that all of us in our small town thought very highly of our Mr. Amritlal. You see, we were almost all, one way or another, his employees. Every so often, we used to meet in the school hall, built with his money, by the way, and we used to speechify and put garlands round his neck and clap and stamp our feet when the chairman announced how much he'd given away this time to what charity. The old bloodsucker, the youngsters used to call him, but we older ones didn't agree. We had our jobs to think of. You see, our Amritlal was, among hundreds of other sidelines, a big cement merchant. You should have seen his go-downs. And you should have seen the buildings in the big town nearby. Put up with our Amritlal cement they were. Well, it appears that one day in the big town, the coolies were chucking the cement into the mixer and, well, one bag hadn't got cement in it at all. The foreman fellow looked at it, and guess what it was? Rice. Rice, mind you, in a cement bag. Now, I myself would never have thought of telling the police about a thing like that. But those people in the big town did. And imagine, they suspected Amritlal of being up to something. Well, they can do that sort of suspecting business in the big town, but none of us would have dared think of such a thing in our small town. And you know, they dared to keep a watch on his house. Secretly, of course. I myself saw the plainclothes man poking his head in and out of the gate, but he didn't catch Amritlal out that way. So, next night they hid in the bushes, much more sensible, I think, and watched Amritlal coming out of his go-down. What he'd have said if he'd only known. And guess what they found on the doorstep after he'd gone? Rice. It was always rice everywhere Amritlal went. This time on the steps of what was supposed to be a cement go-down. They really thought they'd found out something this time, and so the police in the big town made out a search warrant. And then it was funny. Our Amritlal was in there a day or so after, and there was a knock at the door. And who should come in but a spick-and-span police officer? And guess who it was? The police officer of our town. But that's not the funny part. That comes later. But you'll have to admit it was an awkward bit of duty for the young man. And wasn't Amritlal angry? But there it was, orders were orders, and the young police officer looked around for a bag to jab his knife into. And now comes the funny bit. In he jabs his knife, out he pulls his knife, and on his knife there is cement. Did you ever hear anything like it? The police officer was so put out, poor fellow, that he didn't dare look in another bag. If he had, maybe he'd have found the rice he was looking for. But all he could think of was getting out before Amritlal said some more hard things. Of course, there was a fine to do at the police office. You see what they'd done? They'd accused a man, a big man too, and they'd gone into his go-down, and then there was no evidence. You can't imagine anything worse. Believe me, it looked bad for the police. So there was nothing else for it but to write a letter of apology. You see, that was what they call a neat trick. If Amritlal was guilty of hoarding rice, he'd be put off his guard. If he was innocent, well, apologies are apologies. And didn't Amritlal laugh? A friend of mine heard him right out on the street. Of course, by this time, everyone in our small town knew that Amritlal was guilty. We knew most of the funny things that went on in that go-down every night. filling up cement bags with rice and then piling the bags up with the real cement ones so that no one could tell the difference. We knew, but Amritlal was sharp. He was clever, we had to admit that. You could never get anything on him. And from what I could hear of it, the police felt that way too. They knew he was guilty, all right, but how to grab him red-handed? That was their trouble. Well, there was a problem for you. And then suddenly the police chief got an answer. Guess what he did? He sent round to another department and said, "Send me up a beard." Then he told the sub-inspector that he was going to be disguised in that beard, and then he told him what the rest of his plan was. And was it a good plan? You'll see. And now comes the tricky bit. You see if you don't think it's clever. The sub-inspector says, "I'm a merchant from up country." Just like that. And then he says, "I'm out to make some money, quick." Just like that. And then, of course, Amritlal's manager put his silly money-grubbing head right into the trap. "Buy grain," he says. And I know how to do it. Now, the sub-inspector didn't pull off his beard then and there and say, "I arrest you." Oh, no. Do you know what he did do? He bribed him. 100 rupees. 100 rupees, mind you. Of course, Amritlal was still as clever as ever he was, and he didn't like the idea of selling to any stranger who happened to come from up country. But the manager, who felt very pleased with his 100 rupee note, said, "Oh, no, he's an old friend of mine. I know him well." Well, Amritlal liked money too, and he said, "Yes, all right." And then the big moment came. And did I laugh when I heard all about it. The manager fellow goes off to get the rice out of the go-down. Manager looks a bit worried when the detective walks up, and then the policeman, just at the red-handed moment, as you might say, come on and arrest him. Then there was a to-do. "It wasn't me," said the manager. "I didn't do it. It was him," meaning the boss, Amritlal. And then, of course, when they get into the house, Amritlal says, "I didn't do it. It was him," meaning the manager. And did I laugh when I heard how they went at one another? The inspector stripped off his beard just like a play and said, "The game's up," or something like that. I can guess that Amritlal didn't look then much like the man who was the boss of our town. I was at the court myself personally when they passed sentence on the old bloodsucker. It's funny how those youngsters back in our small town were right. He was a bloodsucker after all. And the judge didn't exactly use that word, but to my mind he said a lot worse. It was funny and quite a lesson to hear it all being said about our Amritlal. "You," the judge said, "you were personally responsible for the fact that hundreds of poor people went short of food," he said. "You," he said, "you were responsible for those food queues," he said. What he meant to say was that Amritlal was a monster. And quite right, too. 3 years, he said, "I give you. 3 years in prison." And you should have seen Amritlal when he heard. And there he is still, behind bars. Where all his type ought to be, I say.